Yeah. So what's our? Oh. Yeah, good.
Good evening. Welcome to the National Constitution Center, and thank you for joining us at tonight's town hall program. My name is Lana Ulrich. I'm in-house counsel here at the Constitution Center. And before I introduce our guests for tonight's program, I just want to give a quick plug for some of our upcoming town hall events. Next week, we will welcome leading Civil War and Reconstruction historians David Blight, Eric Foner, and Tavolia Glimpf to explore the history of emancipation as part of our celebration of the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment. On December 11th, we'll host two back-to-back panels on gerrymandering and the future of American democracy with scholars and advocates from both sides of the debate. And finally, on December 15th, we'll have our annual Bill of Rights Day Symposium, which will feature 3 constitutional conversations on the state of the First Amendment, the evolution of the Bill of Rights, and the father of the Constitution, James Madison. And for lawyers out there, PA Continuing Legal Education Credit will be offered at all 3 programs. You can check out our website for more info. I should note that only members receive free tickets to our town hall programs and discounted tickets to evening programs and CLE offerings. If you're interested in becoming a member, please visit our membership table outside in the lobby. Okay, so we're here tonight to discuss the rise of conservatism in America and how the election of Donald Trump scrambled political alliances and raised the question of what it means to be conservative in America. To introduce our guest speakers, Jacob Heilbrunn is the editor of The National Interest, and he's the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons. Dr. Charles Kesler is Senior Fellow of the Claremont Institute, editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and a distinguished professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. He is also the author of I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism. Sam Tanenhaus is an American historian, biographer, and journalist, and he is the author of The Death of Conservatism, A Movement and Its Consequences. Please join me in welcoming our guests. So we're over a year out from the 2016 election, which shook up the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as well, and saw a new leader, Donald Trump, become the face of the Republican Party, and some would say conservatism in America. Tonight we're going to talk about the 2016 election, the Trumpian brand of conservatism, where the GOP is now and where it's headed. But before we do so, I'd like to briefly discuss the history of conservatism in America, this being in the Constitution Center, tracing it back to the founding and kind of understanding where conservatism originated and help us to understand a little bit more about where it is today. So I guess we can start with Jacob. Can you talk a little bit about the origins of conservatism tracing back to the founding? What was conservatism, or where was conservative philosophy present during the Revolution, the Constitutional Convention? If you want to talk a little bit about Edmund Burke, and if there was anything that was inherently conservative about what the founders were trying to do in constructing our government.
Well, many conservatives in the 20th century grappled with the problem that there wasn't really a conservative tradition in America, at least as it was depicted by many liberal historians. There's a famous book by Louis Hartz, which claimed that because of the absence of a feudal tradition in the United States, that there really was no basis for the kind of aristocratic conservatism that you had had in Europe. And I think Charles probably will make a better case for there having been a conservative tradition at the outset. There are all sorts of arguments about the nature of the American Revolution itself, whether it was a conservative revolution in contrast to the French Revolution, or whether, as the historian Gordon Wood has argued, there was a certain radicalism inherent in America liberating itself from the British. When I look at the nature of American conservatism today, I think that it really emerges after the turn of the century, and that it has 2 wings. One is a Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover wing, and then there is another wing that is a more optimistic and expansive view of government. And so I think there have been two wings. There's the patrician wing in the Republican Party, the internationalist Republican wing, and then there's the Goldwater wing. And what we're seeing today, and Sam I'm sure will elaborate on this, is that many of the impulses that first started to manifest themselves in the 1950s as well in American conservatism have taken on new life. We have today a populist conservatism in Trump that does have antecedents in 20th century conservatism. But I'm sure Charles is, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but having just written on the Claremont Institute, I just wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books on it, and I think Charles is quite well equipped to look at the nature of the American founding and conservatism.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a good piece, by the way. I recommend it. And this is a tough question. You know, there was a kind, I guess you could say, the terms liberal and conservative were not used in a partisan sense in the 1790s or the 1780s as they are used now, as they began to be used really in the early 20th century. And so when you had Jefferson and Hamilton sort of heading the two major parties in the 1790s, from our point of view, you might say Jefferson seems like a liberal, but he was for a very strict construction of the Constitution and for states' rights. And Hamilton, who seems more like a conservative, was for a broad reading of national power and was for a very diminished role for state governments in national affairs. And they didn't call each other liberal and conservative. When they wanted to be nasty and partisan, the Jeffersonians called Hamilton a monocrat, that is, a secret lover of monarchy who wanted to bring back the British Constitution. And when Hamiltonians wanted to be nasty towards Jefferson, they accused him of being a Jacobin, a French revolutionary or an atheist or something like that. It's really, these terms are basically, I would say, 20th century terms. And Franklin Roosevelt is the president who put the liberal label on the Democratic Party really for the first time, and it has stuck ever since in the contemporary meaning of liberalism as being in favor of the living Constitution, a flexible reading of the Constitution, and an expansive federal government and an expansive federal role of agencies working on problems in society. And then it's odd that liberal really becomes a current term in American politics before conservatism does. And here Sam can say a lot, I'm sure. Bill Buckley really founded, I think, the first magazine in America that called itself conservative when he founded National Review in 1955. And before that, conservatives, people we might call conservatives, had resisted the label of conservative, arguing that they were liberals, classical liberals. They were the real liberals, and what the people we would call liberals were statists or something else. But Buckley finally gave up, and Goldwater gave up, and eventually everybody gave up and accepted the moniker of conservative. But really fairly late, not until the 50s, I'd say.
Yeah, I think, although there's a temptation to go all the way back to the founding, I'm not sure that's really useful for this. Because what separated the founding of the United States from the other nations, what later became the other Western democracies, was just so radical in its ideas of class, the relationship between business and government. We called ourselves a free nation, but we had slaves when other countries didn't. I think it's almost not worth doing. I think also that is to use those terms, and I would say also the terms liberalism and conservatism are not that useful. We are fortunate, all of us, to live in a time when there is one genius who writes about politics, Gary Wills, who's been doing it for about 50 years now, And if you read him, he was a protege of Bill Buckley, who then went left. If you read him, he almost never talks about conservatism. He talks about conservatives. He doesn't talk about liberalism. He talks about liberals. Why? Because that's how most of us think of ourselves. We're conservative on some things. We're liberal on others. The philosophical terms are almost useless. We'll hear many people on the right talk about how they want a limited government, and yet when certain issues come up, they want the government to have a lot of reach and a lot of power. Liberals want to talk about the autonomy and independence they want people to have until they start asserting their own groupthink and telling people what values they should have. They're almost useless terms. The terms, but as Gary Will says, they're the ones we're stuck with. So we don't have any other way of talking about them. We have left and right, which also doesn't make sense here, but we use those terms. I think we're better off just kind of looking at what's right around us now and interpreting it, each of us, through our own experience and the memories we have, rather than pretending there's some long, complicated philosophical tradition, because you will just get tangled up in knots if you do it. Mm-hmm. That's the result of my having dug around in this stuff for all these years. The more I do it, the less I know. Let me add one thing to what Charles said. He's right about a National Review, which was founded in 1955, essentially calling itself the first conservative magazine. In the very first issue announcing that magazine, the very young Bill Buckley, who was then 29 years old, referred to himself and his colleagues as radical conservatives. A generation before, the term would have been an oxymoron, because what do conservatives do? They preserve, they're opposed to radicals. How can you possibly be a radical conservative? Only if you mean something different by conservative than what conservatives normally mean. The other thing is, Charles is right when they wanted to call themselves liberals and were forced to call themselves conservatives. So they referred to the other liberals, that is New Deal Democrats, with a capital L. And when Bill Buckley wrote his one and only attempt at a philosophical work called Up From Liberalism, published in 1959, he capitalized liberalism throughout. Then when the book was reissued 9 years later, 1968, Bill decided he would give up, and he just lowercase liberal throughout, because those are the terms other people use. And because we're a democracy, I think we're better off just kind of going with the normal terms in circulation rather than trying to come up with more complicated descriptions and definitions. Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that Bill's first book was God and Man at Yale, which was published in 1951, just 4 years before he started the magazine. But in that book, he doesn't call himself a conservative. He calls himself a Christian individualist. But by 55, just 4 years later, he had accepted the label, and it entered the mainstream of American politics as a result of that. I would say one last thing maybe on this Constitution question. Conservatives do, especially these days, think of themselves, especially ones that deal with the courts, as originalists, meaning that they believe in the authority of the original Constitution as amended, and want to go back to the text and maybe the tradition of interpretation of that Constitution as the authoritative sort of touchstone for our law. And liberals, while not disdaining or rejecting the original Constitution, think it has to be understood as a living document, and we can't be bound by the views of a world that is dead and gone, as the late Justice Brennan once put it. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to just interject and say that what Sam is talking about, and Charles, is not esoterica, because if you look at Buckley's first book, it was an attack on an elite Ivy League university that he attended. Right. And I've paged through some of Sam's early archival documents. And
what do you mean? Some of the things I wrote?
No, that you had at your place.
Oh, the Buckley Archives.
His first fundraising letter.
Documents you've stolen from the Buckley Archives.
What's so interesting is that Bill Buckley essentially invented, or maybe invented is too strong, but certainly propelled the war against elites, political correctness, all the things that give conservatism its radical edge today. were pioneered by National Review in the 1950s, I think.
And what's great is, Jacob and Charles both know this very well, is our enemy of the elites, Bill Buckley, grew up in a 47-acre estate in Litchfield County, Connecticut. That was the family's summer home, and the winter home was 15 acres in South Carolina. So it's a war against, and Bill Buckley himself was a member of Skull and Bones. If any of you know what Skull and Bones, the secret society, are there any people who follow this kind of thing at all? Bill Buckley was the last man tapped for Yale, for Skull and Bones at Yale. And that meant you were number one on the campus. It was all guys back then. And number two was the first person tapped for Skull and Bones. So you all gathered out in the courtyard. And then Bill is kind of waiting, am I going to make it? And he became number one. So he was doing all of this from very much inside what we would think of as the establishment. And the more I study Bill Buckley and think about him and write about him, because I don't know if you got mentioned, I've been working on a biography of him for a long time. At his instigation, he really wanted me to do it, is how Bill was really doing a couple of things at once that sound very familiar today, William F. Buckley. One was to kind of conquer the cultural world of the establishment, which is partly what Jacob is talking about, to kind of declare himself as a Yale man and somebody who's a master of television, with his show Firing Line, the many books he wrote, the columns he wrote. He was the most famous intellectual of his time in America, I think it's fair to say. He was the most recognizable if you saw him on the street. And at the same time, he was kind of a radical. He was ideologically radical. And that combination, I think, I'd like to hear you guys on this, is a little bit of what we're seeing again now. That it's shaking up the establishment of the party. Bill's opposition was led against the Republican Party. National Review was founded in November 1955 is when the first issue came out. And what's interesting, it's kind of forgotten now, even by people who do the history, is the big event in America had been Dwight Eisenhower's heart attack. It's September 1955. The general assumption was he would not run for re-election. If there's anybody here who remembers that or has read about it, National Review got going quickly so they could kind of take over the competition and push their guy forward to be the next Republican nominee. And 2 points to anybody in this room, including my fellow panelists, who know which Republican they were rallying behind to succeed Dwight Eisenhower. William Noland of California, which shows you how these things change, because he's totally forgotten today. But he was a major figure in his time. He was a senator. Yeah. He had been the majority leader, handpicked by Robert Taft, then the minority leader after the House changed hands. But my point really is that the war was waged against, even then, the Republican establishment. And that's what we saw again. I think both you guys could comment on this in 2016, right? Aren't we even seeing that in Alabama? The war is more against McConnell than it is against the Democrats, right? Why is it? One of you guys explain why that is.
Well, if you really want to go back, some historians trace it back to the 1912 election when the Republican Party split. And that you always had this divide in the GOP between the patricians and the more rowdy crowd inside the GOP. And there's always been a fear in the GOP of the patrician class as potential traitors to the GOP. And, to bring it up to today, this is why I think conservatism now, what Sam is talking about, does have a radical edge. Let's look at the tax bill that's going through. The Democrats, in a way, are the conservatives, right? They're trying to preserve and expand the welfare state that we've had, at least since the New Deal. And the Republicans, and I'd be interested to hear Charles on this, are trying to tear down this edifice that has been created and revert to a older pre-New Deal America. That would be my read. So I would say I mean, Charles might argue that that's a conservative project because it's getting back to what America was. But I do think that in today's context, it has a bit of a radical edge. And the reason it gets back to what I was talking about, what do you conserve as a conservative in America? What's to conserve?
Right. Well, this has always been the question for conservatives. I mean, conservatives have always known what they were against more clearly than what they're in favor of or what they're for. And so there have been always these interesting debates within conservatism over what it is we ought ultimately to be conserving. You know, whether it's the tradition, virtue, liberty, the Constitution, whatever. But they, despite these disagreements, which were quite interesting and remain interesting, they were pretty clear that they opposed the Soviet Union and socialism abroad and at home, broadly speaking. And that's still, I think, the case. But it is interesting that conservatives do have in their DNA somehow an anti-establishment a gene, which is activated every generation or so. I mean, when Bill Buckley started, he was quite radical in his own way. He was defending McCarthy against the Republican establishment, including Eisenhower. And so...
Defending Joe McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy, yes, that's right. Not Gene. Or any other McCarthy. Or any other McCarthy. And so there's some of Trump's unorthodox opinions and ways, were in the air in a different context in the 1950s. McCarthy was a very unorthodox politician and an orthodox character, which didn't prevent Bill from defending him and writing or producing 2 books on the subject of defending McCarthy. But yes, I would say there are some things about Trumpian conservatism today that do hark back to earlier 20th century conservatism, and particularly to the older Republican conservatism. I mean, if you think of Calvin Coolidge, if you think even before him of William McKinley, and of the whole party going all the way back to Lincoln, they were all high tariff, high protective tariff politicians. Republicans were the party of protection and protectionism. Trump is in a way a throwback to the older pre-New Deal, pre-World War II Republican Party on that question. On immigration also, there's a lot of...
foreign policy too.
And to some extent even on foreign policy. So I think if you look at where the conservative movement is now, it is in the process, we don't know yet. I think it's too early to say where we're going exactly, but in a way you see a kind of fusion between post-World War II conservatism and pre-World War II conservatism. It's very uneasy, it's very rough and ready, and I'm not sure where it goes from here, but you can see at least in outline, that there might be something that is coherent in there.
You know, it's interesting, Karl Rove, remember him? About a year ago or so, I reviewed the book for Jacob. Jacob's magazine wrote a big book about William McKinley, and he was trying to make the case really against Trump and Ted Cruz, but Trump in many ways is closer to McKinley than Karl Rove and George Bush were. Another thing I would add, just for people's interest, and in my narcissism, I think what's interesting to me, what may interest other people, is I've become increasingly impressed by and admiring of Eisenhower. I think Eisenhower was the greatest modern American president. And it's interesting because of this establishment we're talking about that Buckley and other radical conservatives were opposed to was Eisenhower's Republican Party. And in retrospect, Eisenhower, Jacob, I'd be interested to hear you on this, did kind of a remarkable thing, because if you look at it in terms of party politics, right, we'd had this unprecedented thing. We'd had Democrats who won every single presidential election held in 2 decades, the 1930s and the 1940s, right? Franklin Roosevelt was elected 32, 36, and then 1940 and 44, and then Truman won in 48. So we have these 5 elections in a row. Nothing like that had ever happened before. And if you want to know what landslides look like, go check out the numbers for Roosevelt's first two elections. It's just mind-boggling how much he won by. So that meant the Republicans, when Eisenhower took office, elected in 1952, he was assembling the first Republican cabinet since 1928, basically. And so the question was, will Eisenhower's Republican Party be like the one Jacob and Charles have described of Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover and Warren Harding, or will Eisenhower more or less institutionalize the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt and say the conservative thing to do in Jacob's terms would be, well, people kind of like their Social Security. I don't think we're going to take it away from them. Just as Reagan decided he wasn't going to take people's Medicare away from them when he'd been preaching against it for a long time. That was, in some ways, the most important shift in modern American politics, is that when a Republican was elected after that long string of Democratic presidents and huge Democratic majorities in the legislature, Eisenhower decided to keep things in place. So from the terms Jacob was using before, by those terms, Eisenhower would then seem to be the most conservative figure of his time because he preserved the thing that worked. But to the radical conservatives, the Bill Buckleys and the others in the right wing of the Republican Party, Eisenhower was essentially a traitor. And this is an ideological traitor, not an unpatriotic one. And this is one reason they supported Joe McCarthy, because McCarthy was the biggest threat to Eisenhower. McCarthy, Noland, and these others were the threat to him. That was that wing of the Republican Party that did seem radical in its own moment. And if you go back and look at the history and the journalism of the period, that's almost always how it's described, as a kind of radicalism of the right, which was a common term back then, which we're beginning to see again a little bit, right? A sense that radicalism is coming out of...
Well, I'd like to put Charles on the spot here as the resident pro-Trumper among us. When you look at the Trump administration,
Yes.
and what we're seeing with this tax bill, which, if you believe the mainstream media, is
Which I don't, but go
ultimately
ahead.
a big shift of wealth towards the
1%.
towards the rich. Is Trump, in fact, by signing on to a Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell tax cut economic program, is he fulfilling the populist aspirations that he talked about during the campaign, or is he in fact betraying his followers?
Well, it depends on whether you think the bill is ultimately good for the people. I mean, that is to say, for middle class and working class families. And I think the economic arguments for that are pretty good. I mean, they're not. I don't believe that there is, the science of economics is a science in the sense that it can really predict with 100% accuracy what the economic effects of the tax bill will. But it's a plausible case to me that they will, in fact, stimulate jobs, which will help middle class and working class people. Of course, when you're cutting income taxes, the 1% who pay 40% of the income tax receive the biggest, have to receive the biggest cuts because they're paying an unusually and outrageously perhaps large share.
No, they don't. They've shipped most of it overseas, and it's not a question of an equal tax being applied across the board. It's actually weighted in their favor.
Well, you sounded like Trump there for a minute about those jobs going overseas, and I think
well, except Trump won't do anything about it. He'll just talk about it.
Well, he's done a few things. We're still, it is true though that there is no. I mean, in the 19th century there was a populist party, there was a people's party. It had a platform. It had a worked out economic and political theory. It wanted to make silver, the basis of currency, not just gold. It wanted to inflate the economy. It wanted to, a few constitutional amendments for direct primary elections and things like that. There is no populist party, and so what we sometimes call, journalists and analysts call populism here, is a very strange, elusive idea. It's a movement, maybe, of sorts. You know, Trump has never named his movement. He keeps referring to this movement that elected him, but he's never called it a Trump movement. He's never called it a populist movement. He really, it's mysterious and amorphous in his consciousness, and I think in a way in everybody's consciousness. It's not clear that in a country where government is now so big and power so concentrated in Washington, that you can really have a populism that's anything like the old-fashioned populism, because there are no levers for the people to get hold of the government easily and do what they would like to do with the government, to shrink it, to limit immigration, to whatever the policies are that a popular majority or a populist majority may be interested in. It's very hard to translate that into policy, much harder than it was in the 19th century to do, because of the very, you know, every year in a way the government gets bigger, every year trust in government goes down. And those two trends are well ground, you know, they're long-running trends now,
well,
multi-decade trends.
But it's more complicated than that. You know, if you go back and read a great book Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote called The Politics of the Guaranteed Income, which was published in the early 70s, where you can see three great serializations in it, published in the New Yorker magazine of all places in 1973. And very early on, Moynihan says that, so he's writing about what happened when he first worked for Nixon, because Moynihan had worked for Democrats, Kennedy and Johnson. Then he went to work for Nixon as his kind of urban and social planning czar. And so a Gallup poll had come out around the time Nixon got elected that showed that the public, when asked which of the bigs they most disliked, and in those days it was big business, big labor, a term that almost doesn't exist anymore because labor unions were so much more powerful then. You know, about a third of the workforce belonged to labor unions. And big business, big government, and big labor, big government was the one everybody said they hated most. Except when you ask people what social programs they wanted to give up, which ones do you think they wanted to get rid of? None of them. None of them. How many programs did Ronald Reagan, the great shrinker of government, get rid of? None of them. No, instead you got ever bigger budgets and ever bigger expenditures, because that is actually what a majority of the public wants. So Charles, we do not see, I'm not aware of any evidence that a majority of the American people actually are supporting what these populist programs are. Trump has got 37 or 38%.
Well, no,
Let me follow on
my
quickly.
point was, I'm not sure what populism is under the current conditions. It is certainly true that Trump is being populist in not pushing for entitlement cutbacks. I mean, he stayed very far away from that.
No, he wants to get rid of the health care bill. He tried repeatedly to get rid of the health care act.
Well, but he's not touching the historic entitlements, Medicare, Social Security.
And which politician today would? Name me one who would. What is radical about Donald Trump not wanting to take away Social Security?
I'm not advocating doing anything in particular to them. I'm just saying that what populism is a very elusive question, especially because you know, this isn't just an American problem. I mean, if you look at developed countries all over the world, if you look at Europe in particular, there are all kinds of populist movements taking place in European countries, disrupting the usual distribution of power among the parties and making it hard to read the future of continental politics or the future of American politics. And the first casualty of populism in Europe has been mainstream parties of the left. I mean, the Socialist Party in France went from being the majority party that had formed the government to polling 7% in the last presidential election. And similar things have happened to socialist parties in other countries in Europe. There are disruptive effects on the right wing, too, from these new populist movements. But so far, I think you make a pretty good argument that the left has suffered most from them. That may be the case in the United States, but I think, again, it's too early to say. But I sort of wanted to go back to this question of radical conservatism, since you brought it up. I'm not so sure that those two terms are so opposed to each other. I mean, a radical conservatism to me seems to mean conserving the things that are fundamental or at the root. I mean, the most radically important things. And Americans have all, you know, Burkeanism, you mentioned Burke, so I'll mention Burke too. You know, Burkean conservatism is a British style of conservatism that has had a few American enthusiasts, but it's never been a defining part of American politics. There's a Burkean wing of the conservative movement, or at least there used to be a Burkean wing of the conservative movement. But American conservatism has always gone back to the founding. And the founding is the result, the Constitution, the Declaration, these are the result of a revolution. So oddly, our conservatism traces itself back to a revolution. Burkean conservatism is anti-revolutionary. It begins by opposition, essentially, to the French Revolution. So American conservatism is quite different from Burkean, and for an American conservative to be radical seems to me to be almost second nature. For a Burkean to be radical would be a contradiction in terms, I think. But
yeah,
not in
I think that's a fair point. Yeah, go ahead.
Charles, I'm curious to ask you the same question all over again about foreign policy.
Oh, okay.
How would you feel today? We hear that Tom Cotton could become head of the CIA, Pompeo at the State Department, Nikki Haley. How would you feel?
Wait, what's Nikki Haley supposed to be?
She's at the UN. She was rumored to be headed for state, but that seems to have dissipated. But the question I have is, you put these people in the Trump administration. Trump campaigned on America first. Talked about restraints, not getting mired in Middle East wars. You put these people in, and many people in Washington, both at the places like the American Conservative, which backed Trump, Pat Buchanan was affiliated with. And I saw Pat Buchanan the other night, and he's terrified that Trump is going to go to war in one or both, North Korea and Iran. How would you feel if this occurred? If Trump pursues a highly militarized foreign policy, do you think that would be a betrayal, or do you think it would be a good thing for the conservative movement, the Republican Party in the country?
Well, I would be very surprised if Trumpian foreign policy would accept involvement in a land war in the Middle East, or a land war in Korea, for that matter. I mean, I think what Trump learned from, in a way, the whole Trumpian movement is a reaction to the failure of the Bush presidency, the second Bush, George W. Bush's presidency. Domestically, it didn't go very well, but in foreign policy, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, and then the democratization campaign didn't work out as well as the second generation neoconservatives and others in the administration had anticipated. And I think in a way the party, for many years after that, you had McCain as a candidate, you had Romney as a candidate. There was no daylight between them and the second Bush administration, Bush the younger. But in Trump, you had the first Republican who openly said that those policies, and indeed the whole administration in a way, domestically and in foreign policy, had been a failure, and that we needed to start over in a way. That, I think, is why Trump would be very, very wary of getting involved in an actual land war in either of those countries. If he did get involved in such a war, I don't think he would. I think it would be, to the extent possible, a short intervention, not sticking around to democratize them or to prepare them for self-government. I think it would be a short and violent campaign rather than a long and administration of the area.
We're rolling over our
Just to
moderator.
kind of,
We need
just to kind of elaborate a little more. So could you talk a little bit more about how that's different from, let's say, Bush conservatism and neoconservatism approach to foreign policy?
Do you want to take that?
Well, ostensibly, Mr. Trump touted that he would pursue an America First policy. And I saw the speech when he delivered that. I was sitting 20 feet from him. And he was...
Jacob, explain historically what America First really means.
America First is associated with the isolationist movement of the late 1930s, but it was started by liberals who were... There was a lot of despondency in the United States after World War I, especially with disappointment among liberals with the Woodrow Wilson administration, the failure of the war to have really achieved a lasting peace. So America First started as a liberal movement against war. It was then essentially, I think, hijacked by more right-wing forces, including Charles Lindbergh, and it became...
There was a lot of students on campuses.
Yeah, at Yale, McGeorge Bundy.
800,000 people belonged to the America First Committee.
Including Bill Buckley, I believe.
Very much Bill Buckley and Gore Vidal, his great opposite number. They were both
But the phrase did become tainted because it became associated with apologies for not intervening against Nazism and apologies for Nazism as well. And I was discomfited that Trump would pick up this phrase. I think it was ill-advised, but it didn't seem to harm him during the campaign. I don't think Trump ever felt that comfortable actually talking about foreign policy.
I have a question for Jacob. Since you know so much about foreign policy, and particularly and Europe and Germany above all, what's the perception? How does Trump look to those, let's say, foreign policy elites compared to how Obama and George W. Bush looked to them? What do they make of him? How do they interpret him?
It's a mixture of fear and incredulity.
But isn't Charles's point true though, that we have a global populist movement? I mean, to me, one of the great paradoxes of Trump is he became a truly global figure after the Brexit vote. I write, one of the magazines I write for is a British publication called Prospect. Comes out every month. And I was writing a column for them during the election, and they always wanted another piece on Hillary Clinton. And I told them early on, you know what, she's not really the story. Donald Trump is the story. So I wrote a couple of pieces about him, which they were happy to have. And then the Brexit vote came, and it was all Trump all the time. And sometimes I think, and Jacob, this is really what I'm asking you, isn't Trump in some ways kind of familiar to them in that they can look at their own histories and think they've seen somebody like him before?
Yeah, no, I don't think Trump is entirely novel. I mean, if you look at Austrian history, and I'm not talking about Hitler, I'm talking about, other figures in Austrian history, the turn of the century, the Viennese mayor, Karl Lueger, or figures, he is sort of a European populist. But in Western Europe, I don't think you can say that in Hungary, you have someone like Trump, or someone more akin to Trump, but not in Germany or England. I mean,
what about Scandinavia, where they also
there are all these parties and forces, but I wouldn't say that we've actually elected someone like that to run the country. That is unprecedented, and that of course has to do with the internal collapse of the Republican Party after the Bush era. I mean, Trump doesn't arise out of nothing, and he kicked in a rotting door in the Republican Party during the primaries. That's why I did believe early on, and I wrote it in January, that he would win the Republican nomination.
You know, I think one of the points Charles made is really important too. Jacob's line about kicking the rotting door has become kind of a famous line in our politics, and I think it's true that Trump came along and, look, he ran against 16 people. If you remember, pundits like George Will were saying this was the most talented Republican field at least since 1980 and maybe even before. Now, I think George was wrong because the 68 field was a better one than 1980. That was Percy and Romney and Nixon and Reagan. But still, his point, and others on conservatives agree with him, Charles, this was a brilliant field of candidates, and Trump obliterated them. It wasn't even a close competition from beginning to the end. Never forget that Ted Cruz ran as the evangelical and could not hold that vote in the deep South against Donald Trump. And we're seeing again in Alabama now. So there is a powerful force behind him, and I think what my colleagues are saying is really true. A lot of that was the consequence of the failure of the Bush administration. I think it's one place where left and right in America would absolutely agree. You'll read Gary Will says the same thing. The war in Iraq is what gave you Donald Trump. So a little riff that I do, and I get to do it again in front of an audience, is people will often say that Donald Trump speaks in a kind of free association, stream of consciousness, right? He sounds like Molly Bloom in Joyce's Ulysses. You don't know how you got from the beginning of one sentence to the end of another, except in the South Carolina debate. And I will quote you verbatim the most lucid sentences spoken maybe by anyone on either side in that campaign. You ready? Quote, "They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none." Right? Grammatically perfect and absolutely true. He said it in one of the most conservative states in the country where the Bushes are admired. And that primary is what drove Jeb Bush out of
Actually,
Sorry.
Sam is, if I can just quickly,
Sure.
he's underestimating Trump's rhetorical skills. Someone who really zeroed in on it is David Bromwich at Yale. And if you heard it again the other night when Trump was talking about the Democrats not showing up in the White House. And again, yes, he uses simple, emphatic language. He keeps calling them weak. You know, he just pounds away at very simple tropes. And I think it is effective. And Bromwich contrasted it with someone like Barack Obama, who has assimilated a much more corporate style of speaking, except in certain speeches when he really cut loose.
Yeah.
But people, I think, in America are reacting viscerally against, let's face it, the Republican field in 2016 wasn't impressive. These were phonies.
Oh, I totally agree.
And Trump actually was authentic in what he was stating or with the problem he was diagnosing.
No, he won because he was by far the best candidate. That's how it works most of the time in our politics.
I don't think
So
they were
since-
phonies, but I
sorry.
think they were
There's a
inferior
high
candidates
degree, a
to
high
Trump.
degree of dissimulation.
Yeah.
Well, since President Trump has been elected, it seems like he has, at least in terms of filling the judiciary with more traditional conservative judges. Can you just talk a little bit about that? What is the future of the Supreme Court going to look like if President Trump has another appointment? I mean, obviously we don't know who he's going to appoint, and as he fills the lower federal judiciary as well, what's the future of conservatism going to look like in the country based on that?
Well, when I was saying before that populism doesn't have a lever by which to really take hold of government, in order to be effective in the long term, I think in this time and place, populism has to become a kind of constitutionalism. That's the way you're going to get some of the things which some populists at least want. And the appointments to the Supreme Court and to the lower federal courts are going to be very, very important. The other thing is the rather amazing progress in the regulatory agencies that Trump has made towards returning them to a more modest and arguably constitutional way of doing business. That involved, in the first place, overriding and with his own executive orders, some executive orders that President Obama had issued. It also meant changing the personnel and simply the rules of the game in some of these agencies. But he has made remarkable progress, only now, I think, beginning to be noticed in the Wall Street Journal and other major mainstream media outlets. And so that is, it seems to me, one of the most important, if not the most important aspect right now, at least, of his and moment and of the populist moment that we're in.
He also brought affirmative action to the Supreme Court, right? Isn't Gorsuch the only Protestant on that? Right? Isn't Gorsuch a Protestant? You know, the Supreme Court is all Jews and Catholics.
He is, that's right. He's the only Protestant.
You know, it's always nice to talk about a return to constitutionalism, but what it really means in some instances, I think I was just visiting my parents in Pittsburgh, was driving home in the evening from the symphony, and then all of a sudden this rotten egg smell started to waft through our car. So it's the freedom to breathe dirty air, too, if you just whack away at environmental regulations. the way the Trump administration is proceeding.
So we only have a couple questions. Or,
not
sorry.
all constitutionalism means cutting government, but it does mean that there ought to be appropriations for agencies, and that they can't derive their own budgets from fees paid by the Federal Reserve, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There are lots of constitutional questions there.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple audience questions. We only have a few minutes left. This question references something Sam said. Sam spoke of speaking in terms of conservatives and not conservatism. In the 20th century, conservatives were a fusionist coalition of libertarians, social conservatives, etc. Who are the quote-unquote conservatives today, and is it a coalition that can last?
Well, I think the question, which is very erudite, sort of points to the problem, which is that once you're talking about coalitions, then you're already talking about different types of people. I think those terms, which were so big for so long, the social conservatives, kind of defense conservatives, and then the economic conservatives, I never understood why they were supposed to be so distinct anyway, because it seems to me they overlap in various ways, right? If you want a strong defense, well, then you're going to have to spend a lot of money to build it, And we come back to Bill Buckley again, and very early on, when he was in his mid-20s, before he started his magazine, or wrote the book on McCarthy, he said that libertarians, individualists as they called them then, were going to have to accept that in order to fight the Cold War, you were going to have a really big, powerful government. And Daniel Bell, made that argument many, many years ago. The whole idea that somehow you're going to shrink a government while you're fighting a Cold War is almost a contradiction in terms. So I think a lot of those terms end up sounding like labels people like to pin on themselves. Somebody I've been writing about in a new article I've got, familiar to both my friends here, is David Frum, the former Bush speechwriter who's now become a big, never-Trumper, as they call them. And one of the points he makes is that there's been a real abandonment of policymaking, domestic policymaking, in the think tanks in Washington. That the reason the Affordable Care Act, right, the repeal and replace never really amounted to anything was the program they were trying to repeal and replace was one that came out of conservative ideology. So once you tried to stop it, you got all tangled up. Because this had been, right, the individual mandate in the markets were supposed to be the Republican solution to health care. Only Republicans ran away from it. So what you have is a policy-making establishment that really doesn't do policy anymore and does this ideology instead. And to me, that's the big dividing line. That's the big crisis that happened with conservatives or conservatism that hasn't been solved. And I'll give you an example of that that's really makes an impression on me. I'll go do some history again because it's what I know best is in 1964 when the Republicans had their great breakthrough and they nominated someone who really was on the right, Barry Goldwater of Arizona. The party put together, and some of the intellectuals connected with it, put something together called the Conservative Papers, and it was going to be a kind of manifesto whereby a President Goldwater might govern. And it had very famous contributors. Milton Friedman was one of them, and some others. And most of what they did was to state conservative principle in the collection of essays. They didn't really talk about policies or programs. Then 4 years later, there was another version of it called the Republican Papers. And it was all about policy. What do we do about poverty? How do we get people college loans and educations? All the things we talk about now. And to me, something will be interesting to look at. Someone at your great magazine, Charles, could look at this, like Bill Vogeley or someone writes for the Claremont Review, is how you got from 1964 to 68. And how you got, in a way, back to 1964 after that. So at this one peak moment, there was more congressional legislation passed during and around the time of Watergate than almost any time before and after. which seems odd to us now because all we remember is the scandal. But in fact, that's when all these environmental regulations were passed and all the rest. Had a Republican president, Democratic majorities, and everything goes through. Is how the Republican Party shifted from the place where they thought in this period when Nixon came into office that they would actually address the same problems liberals did, only with different solutions, to deciding instead that those aren't really problems at all. They're kind of inventions of ideologues. Economic inequality or social justice or all these other things are not ideas conservatives really need to take that seriously. And to me, that's something that comes out of our history. It's not even so much of ideological interest to me as kind of historical interest. And I think once you have a shift like that, then these terms don't mean so much anymore. The ones that are raised in these questions, because they look away from the big elephants in the room, like poverty or health care or jobs and wage stagnation. Those are the things that politicians say they're going to address, and terms like that have almost nothing to do with them.
Charles or Jacob, if you want to respond.
Oh, well, Trump got 90% of the Republican vote. And most Republicans are conservatives, and most conservatives are, I agree on this point with Sam, most conservatives are not just one flavor. They're a mixture of economic conservative, social conservative, national security conservative, constitutionalists. Most conservatives are not single issue or single flavor people, I'd say. But it is true that the conservative movement, as I was saying, was a coalition, and to some degree will remain a coalition. But we don't really know what direction, who's going to control the terms of the coalition. That's really the political question of the season, I'd say.
It's America. We are probably one of the last places with mass parties. I mean, if you look at Europe, all these, at least in the continental Europe, in the recent German elections, it's splintering. The mass parties aren't able to command a large share of the popular vote. And in America, for better or for worse, we don't have a parliamentary system. So both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party consist of uneasy coalitions. And the coalition that FDR constructed had with the South then cracked up after World War II, and the Republican Party took it over. And this is why, I don't know how, the question will be, can Trump does he survive as president his first term, and can he construct a lasting Republican coalition?
No, that's what I'm into. That's the question. I mean, whether he will be able to shape the party in his image, I think, is the question. Because right now, the legislative party, all of the Republicans in Congress are pre-Trump, essentially. I mean, many of them had larger victory margins in their districts or in their states than he did. So he didn't have a lot of coattails. He didn't bring in, he brought in some, but he didn't bring in a lot. He was no Roosevelt in 1932 or 1936.
Or Reagan in 1980.
Or Reagan in 1980. And so, in a way, the congressmen and senators don't owe him anything at this point. And it's a dangerous position to be in when they don't fear you and don't love you. And that's where he stands now.
One of the oddities of our politics is we live in a time where presidents get very narrow victories, but they also get reelected. We had 3 consecutive 2-term presidents. Anybody know the last time, Charles will know when that happened? It was Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Now, you can look at Roosevelt and Truman and say it's essentially the same thing. But there were different figures. And the difference is our presidents, the only one who had anything like a large majority was Obama in 2008. And look what happened to him. It shrank. That was the first sign, really, wasn't it?
Right.
That all this was changing. And I'm one of many who missed it. When George Bush won his second term in 2004, he got 11.5 million votes than he did in 2000. Whether or not you think that was a legitimate election, the first one, he nevertheless added huge numbers the second time around. Obama actually lost millions of votes and yet still was elected pretty handily. He's one of 3 presidents in the last 100 years who have been elected with 51% of the vote or more 2 times. The others were Franklin Roosevelt and Eisenhower. That's it. Obama is one of the most popular presidents in the history of our republic. You know, it's one of these oddities of our politics. It's the fragmentation, I think, that both Charles and Jacob are talking about, where the parties get split in these odd ways. And one last thing I'll add to that is it's not Norman Mailer's very best political book, but if you read his book in the 1972 election, St. George and the Godfather, he's trying to figure out how American politics works. And he says, I need a big idea. And he said, now I think I have one. That our religion in America is our 2 parties. Those are the 2 big churches we all belong to. And I think there's something like that. They're the mega churches in our civic culture, and that's why they still survive even with these strange congregations that we have.
Great. Okay, we have time for one more question. This question is kind of related. In the 2012 autopsy, many Republicans argued that attracting minorities would be crucial for the long-term viability of the GOP, yet President Trump was able to win with overwhelming white working-class support. Was the 2012 autopsy wrong, and is there room for minority participation in conservatism today? Jacob, do you want to start?
Well, if you believe the most dire and apocalyptic assessments on the left spectrum of American politics, then you think that Donald Trump, and from neoconservatives, then you believe that Donald Trump is a not so incipient tyrant, intent not only on shredding democratic norms, but essentially converting the United States into something along the model of Russia, or, and you read this a lot in the Washington Post, and to a lesser degree,
He reads it, the Washington.
in the New York Times. Now, if that scenario does not come to pass, and Trump proves, in fact, to be a weak president, and who in fact is, as I've talked to people ranging from media figures on the conservative end who talk to him regularly, to journalists at places like the New York Times who see Trump more as someone who's highly insecure, uncertain, and is flailing. Then the Republican Party does have a problem. And Trump was then simply an interregnum or a stopgap. The question is, and I don't believe that Trump can actually, and that the GOP can permanently go down the road that it is. It needs to figure out some way of reaching out to what is obviously, the demographics are changing. And I don't see how you're going to stop that.
You know who else says that, by the way, is Patrick Buchanan. I did a long profile of Pat Buchanan. And my wife, Kathy, who's here, was with me when we talked to him. And he is a maestro of United Nations geopolitical and demographic statistics. And he goes through them country by country. And he says, from his perspective, which is very much a kind of proto-Trumpian perspective, it's a rearguard battle. The country is changing demographically, and Pat's the first one to say it. He points out that when he was coming up through politics, Republicans could count on winning California every time. And then he said, well, now California wants to secede. He said, I hope they do it, because no Republican's going to win there for a really long time. So those changes are happening. The autopsy, everybody knows what that is, right? That was the Republican National Committee report commissioned after Mitt Romney's loss. And the reason to remember that, by the way, is many pundits, again, the same ones who were astonished by Donald Trump's rise, were absolutely convinced that Mitt Romney was going to win in 2012. They were absolutely certain he would win, and it might even be a landslide. Someone I really admire, Ross Douthat, the Times op-ed columnist, told me that for a lot of conservatives, they really thought 2012 would be 1932, that Obama had become Herbert Hoover and Republicans would sail in with a big victory, and reverse the course of history. And the autopsy, in a way, is kind of the attempt to explain away why it was they lost then, rather than to look realistically at where the party was, where its support was coming from. So in that sense, the autopsy, it's interesting, preserved in amber as one of these absolutely inaccurate readings of where the party was and what it needed to do, and valuable for that reason.
Well, the social basis of the two parties is shifting. That's one of the reasons why our politics is uncertain right now. You know, it used to be that the Republican Party was reliably the party of the rich and the upper income people, among other groups. But now, increasingly, the more education you have and the more money you make, the more democratic you are. And it's the working class that has deserted the Democratic Party and moved at least to vote for Trump and to some extent to vote for other Republicans down the ticket. So the social basis of the parties is different from what it was. I mean, you have the prediction, therefore, that the ascendant classes of people who are young people, unmarried women, minorities, and others that are supposed to make up the emerging Democratic majority. They have not, that majority hasn't emerged, and it's, you know, the defeat of the Democrats at the hands of Trump showed that precisely the advice from the autopsy was not needed because, if anything, the opposite of that advice was followed in the Trump campaign. I wouldn't go so far, however, as to say that, you know, the Trump appeal can work always and forever. It can't. And there does have to be a kind of outreach in the Republican Party. But a lot of what is happening is that, you know, the definition of the races or the political ethnic groups as voters, as voting populations, those are flexible. And it is, as people intermarry, the race they identify with, the ethnicity they claim, begins to become more fluid. And it may very well be that the percentage of white people in the country will go up, not down, as Asians and others marry whites. This is something that the Census Bureau has written about. It's something that people ought to take a look at because the demographic destiny argument, first the emerging Republican majority back in 1968, then the emerging Democratic majority a decade or more ago, neither of those arguments panned out.
44% of millennials identify as non-white, but I think Charles is actually right. The most important statistical census data you see, say from Pew Research, and so the most interesting documents, most valuable documents you read right now are not Edmund Burke's philosophy. It's the Pew Research census data. They're fascinating, and intermarriage is just through the roof. And those terms are going of you know, racial identification are really going to disappear. That's one reason you see this angry alt-right reaction, because those people know too that all that is changing right under their feet. And by the way, don't forget that that key precincts that Donald Trump won this time around, Obama won either in 2008, 2012, or both times. There's an interesting moment, a book I do recommend, Josh Green's book, Devil's Bargain, about Steve Bannon and Trump and their partnership. If anybody here has read it, the very first chapter actually opens in Trump's headquarters. And the returns are coming in, and they realize he's going to win, because they don't expect it either. And there's all this buzz and excitement, and Trump himself is staring at the TV, and all he says whenever a new return comes in from a new precinct, he would say, "How did Obama do there?" And Josh Green says he had cut through all the kind of complex talk about you know, swing districts and ethnicities and party loyalties. He knew it came down to that one thing, which is the shrewdness I think we all agree he really has, and that moment demonstrates it. He sees every time he wins a precinct, that Obama won, that gets him closer to winning the election. Sometimes I think if he kept that in his head every day, he could actually be a quite successful president.
All right, well, unfortunately we're out of time, but please join me in thanking Jacob, Charles, and Sam.